Adventures are a mechanic from Throne of Eldraine, where creatures had an instant or sorcery attached to them that you could cast instead of casting the creature. If you did, you would exile them, and while they're exiled, you can cast the creature side for its mana cost. This was a very strong mechanic, so today we're going to be looking at some of the more powerful adventures in Magic. And starting us off at number 10, we have Order of Midnight. This is a 2/2 human knight with flying, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures without flying or reach, and it can't block. It has the adventure Alter Fate, which is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black with the effect to return target creature from graveyard to your hand. Order being able to get both a creature back from your graveyard and be a threat made the card an automatic 2-for-1. Something true about a lot of the cards in this list, and why the entire mechanic is remembered for being incredibly strong. However, Order not being able to block can make it a bit unwieldy, as there are times where you might want to trade with one of your opponent's cards and you won't be able to. This isn't anywhere near enough to stop the card from being strong, however. The card saw a lot of play in black aggro decks in Standard, especially green black aggro decks. A card we'll be talking about a lot in this list is Edgewalker Innkeeper. This is a 1/1 human peasant with a mana cost of 1 green that lets you draw a card anytime you cast a creature spell with an adventure on it. If adventure cards weren't good enough on their own, which they were, Innkeeper would have made them good enough anyway. Innkeeper needed to be killed on sight or it would snowball into letting you win the game quickly. Order saw a ton of play in those decks as a good creature who lets you draw off your Innkeeper, but it also saw play in other decks, showing that the card was more than good enough on its own. The card hasn't broken into other formats, so after rotating out of Standard, it stopped seeing play. Order is a great start to this list, as neither half of the card is particularly strong. A 2/2 for 2 with flying and a downside isn't good, and a 2-mana version of Raise Dead isn't either. However, stapling them together as an adventure made it amazing. Every card on this list wouldn't be good enough without being an adventure, but the mechanic itself is good enough that you kind of have to make the individual modes of the cards a little bit weaker to make up for it. And at number 9, we have Shepherd of the Flock. This is a 3/1 human peasant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white with no abilities, but it does have the adventure Usher to Safety, which is an instant with a mana cost of 1 white with the effect to return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. The Shepherd obviously isn't very good on its own, but it can at least trade with 3-drops pretty easily. The main attraction here is obviously the adventure, which is actually far more useful than you might think. A single white to save one of your other creatures from removal is far better than it sounds. Sure, you have to pay the mana for the card again, but you're getting a card from your opponent without losing any cards at all, as you still have your Shepherd on its adventure with the creature you bounce back, making this a +1 in card advantage. The tempo on it is fine, as you would normally be down the entire mana investment on the creature you saved anyway. However, it actually had a ton of synergies in the decks that played it that may not be obvious at first. This card was played alongside Innkeeper as well, and letting you pick up any of your adventure cards not only lets you draw another card off of the Innkeeper, it lets you use the adventure again as well, meaning Shepherd could find you all kinds of action. It can also bounce your lands back to your hand, which matters a lot for landfall cards like Kazandu Mammoth. These cards have abilities that trigger whenever a land enters a battlefield while under your control, getting a +2/+2 until the end of the turn in the case of Mammoth. If you didn't have a land to play that turn, you could bounce a land back to your hand with Usher and just play it again, triggering landfall and not losing any mana at all. Now, these synergies were good enough for the card to see heavy play in Standard, but it didn't quite break into older formats. In those formats, 1 mana is a lot more, so the tempo is a lot more relevant. Not to mention, a vanilla 3/1 for 2 mana is a putrid stat line in anything but Standard. And at number 8, we have Foulmire Knight. This is a 1/1 zombie knight with a mana cost of 1 black and Death Touch, meaning any amount of damage it deals to a creature is enough to destroy it. It also has an adventure named Profane Insight, an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black with the effect where you draw 1 card and lose 1 life. This card, like a lot of adventures, is an automatic 2-for-1. Foulmire is nice as it can trade with basically any creature. This means your opponent doesn't really want to block it, which doesn't matter much as it only has 1 power. More importantly, it makes it very hard to attack into, as it will trade with anything and will almost always trade up the curve, or to put in other words, trade with a more expensive creature. However, more than any other, Foulmire was the card to play Innkeeper. Not only was it one of the few 1-mana creatures with an adventure, it was the only one with Death Touch. This made it really great at drawing you a ton of cards combined with its adventure, easily being a 3-for-1 if you could manage to block something with it. Combining this with the incredible early game pressure that these green-black aggro decks could put out made the deck incredibly hard to beat. You really needed some board wipers to slow the deck down if you wanted to stand a chance. This card also really hasn't seen play outside of Standard, as the adventure package just isn't quite good enough for older formats, and nothing else is really interested in this effect. And at number 7, we have Beanstalk Giant. This is a giant with a mana cost of 6 and 1 green with the ability where its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. It has the adventure Fertile Footsteps, which is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 green that has the effect to search your library for a basic land card and put it into the battlefield, and then you shuffle. Giant is a pretty nice card that pulls double duty in ramp decks. Early on, it's a ramp spell that helps you get to your big, expensive payoffs, and late game, it's one of those expensive threats. Even better, the card synergizes really well with a card called Lucky Clover. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2, with the ability where whenever you cast an adventure instant or sorcery spell, you copy it, and you can choose new targets for that copy. This card is great with pretty much every adventure card, but Beanstalk Giant had one of the better adventures to copy. Getting 2 lands off of your 3 mana ramp spell was great, and lets you get 6 mana on turn 4 in the right circumstances. This is a huge amount of mana and can basically end the game on turn 4 in a lot of games. Now, Beanstalk did see play with Lucky Clover, but it saw a lot of play without it too. Really, it was just one of the better ramp spells in its standard format. There were cheaper ramp spells, but the consistency and late game power that Beanstalk provided was often too good to pass up. In standard, it was usually played to help decks play huge expensive cards, like Ugin the Spear Dragon, Emergent Ultimatum, and Genesis Ultimatum. This is another card that hasn't really seen play in older formats, as they usually have access to cards like Rampant Growth, which were ultimately more consistent and cheaper than Beanstalk was. And at number 6, we have Fae of Wishes. This is a 1/4 fairy wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue with flying and the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 blue and discard 2 cards to return from the battlefield to your hand. It has the Adventure Granted, which is a sorcery with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue with the effect where you can choose 1 non-creature card from your sideboard, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Fae is another in a long line of these wish cards, and these cards have seen quite a bit of play pretty much every time they've been printed. Wishes are very similar to tutors in a number of ways, being able to search one of any number of important cards whenever you need them. There are cards like Slaughter Games, which can exile any number of non-land cards from your opponent's library before they even get a chance to draw them, stopping combo decks right in their tracks. However, if you hide those cards in your sideboard and use a wish effect to grab them, your opponent won't be able to use those types of extraction cards to rip combo pieces out of your deck. They can use them on your wish card, but if you split your combo pieces between your main and sideboard, they'll need at least 2 of those extraction effects to get rid of your combo, at which point it's basically not worth bothering. Fae has some additional upsides over other wish cards, namely being a creature as well. This means you could play it out as an early blocker, and a 1/4 for 2 mana is a pretty good stat line. This has led to Fae of Wishes seen play in Pioneer and Lotus Field combo decks that use the field, a land that can tap for 3 mana, and Twiddle effects, which would let you untap the field to make a ton of mana, and Fae was a great way to find your win condition after making enough mana to cast it. In older formats like Modern or Legacy, Fae has seen a lot less play, as there are cheaper wishes that could find the cards decks wanted to, and the ability to cast it as a creature was less valuable in those faster formats. And at number 5, we have Giant Killer. This is a 1/2 human peasant with a mana cost of 1 white, and the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 white and tap it to tap target creature. It has the Adventure Chop Down, an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white with the effect to destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. Giant Killer is a very nice and versatile card, as playing it on turn 1 to start developing your board, or simply holding it as a removal spell are both plays you'll make in different matchups. The ability to tap your opponent's creatures is a really nice effect that works great both on offense and defense, both stopping a creature from attacking you and tapping down blockers so you can get in for damage. There are other tappers in white, such as Gideon's Lawkeeper, which is actually cheaper to activate than Giant Killer is. However, these cards usually don't see too much play, as while they can be really strong, there are lots of situations where they're not that great. The big issue is that, due to summoning sickness, they can't affect the board at all the turn you play them. And since they're usually pretty small, they're often really bad top decks in the mid and late game where you'll have to wait too long to get any value out of them. Giant Killer fixes this problem by being an adventure and being able to simply be a removal spell in the mid or late game. Sure, it's not the best removal spell, as a 3 mana removal spell with restrictions isn't that great, but it's a versatile removal spell that's also a 2-for-1. This is more than enough to make the card much better than other similar cards. Giant Killer was a really popular card for white aggro mid-range decks in Standard, and has continued to see success in Pioneer. And at number 4, we have Murderous Rider. This is a 2/3 zombie knight with a mana cost of 1 and 2 black. It has lifelink, which means it dealing damage causes you to gain that much life, and whenever it dies, you put it on the bottom of your library. It also has the Adventure Swift End, which is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 2 black with the effect to destroy target creature or planeswalker, and you lose 2 life. Rider is very comparable to cards like Hero's Downfall and its variants, cards which have basically always seen at least a little bit of play in Standard. Unlike Downfall, Rider is, like all adventures, a 2-for-1, which can be really difficult for mid-range decks to deal with. The cost of losing 2 life is basically non-existent a lot of the time. Not only is losing 2 life usually not that big of a cost, but Rider having lifelink means that it can give you that life back really easily. Rider is basically the best version of Downfall in black, so it's no wonder that a ton of black decks were interested in running it. The only card that compares favorably to it is Dreadbore, a 2-mana sorcery with a similar effect, but not every deck will be able to make the red mana they need for it. Rider is something of a black staple in formats like Pioneer, where a 3-mana removal spell that basically draws you a card is extremely good. 3 mana for removal is just too much for older formats, but Rider has a long life ahead of it in Pioneer. The only real flaw with the card is that the creature side is a bit lacking, but the lifelink at least makes it a good blocker against aggro decks. And at number 3, we have Lovestruck Beast. This is a 5/5 Beast Noble with a mana cost of 2 and 1 green, and the ability where the beast can't attack unless you control a 1/1 creature. It also has the adventure Heart's Desire, a source with a mana cost of 1 green with the effect where you create a 1/1 white human creature token. Lovestruck is a severely undercosted creature, and the downside of having to keep the 1/1 token around isn't anywhere enough to slow it down. Not only that, but it doesn't care about where the 1/1 creature came from, meaning that it can be enabled by any other 1/1 creatures you might be playing. This made it great with cards like Edgewall Innkeeper, Foulmire Knight, and Llanowar Elves, which were cards that decks in various formats were more than happy to play anyway. Mana dorks like Elves are especially good, as it lets you get the beast on the battlefield on turn 2, which is way too early for a 5/5 to be coming down. Your opponent basically has to block it, as otherwise they'll simply take far too much damage, or at the very least they'll have to burn a removal spell on it. Another great thing about the card is that even if you don't have a 1/1, it can still block. This means the card is always at least solid against aggro and mid-range decks, as it's great at gumming up the board and deterring attacks until you draw the 1/1 you need to turn it back on. This card was an absolute menace in Standard, and that success has carried over to other formats like Pioneer, and the card has even seen a little bit of success in Modern. And at number 2, we have Bonecrusher Giant. This is a 4/3 giant with the ability where whenever Bonecrusher becomes a target of a spell, it deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. It also has the Adventure Stomp, which is an instant with the mana cost of 1/1 red, with the effect where damage can't be prevented this turn, and then it deals 2 damage to any target. Bonecrusher is a pretty strong creature in its own right, as a 4/3 with an upside for 3 is a good rate. The extra damage is nice for aggro and mid-range decks, even if it isn't the most impactful thing in the world. Stomp is a great adventure. It may be a little overcosted, but the ability to kill cheap threats and then play a truly imposing creature afterwards is amazing. Stomp can snipe so many important early game cards, like Mana Dorks or early threats. A great thing about Bonecrusher is how it sort of curves into itself. Playing Stomp on turn 2 to remove a threat and then playing Bonecrusher on turn 3 is a pretty nice curve, and only using one card to do it puts your opponent in a really bad spot. Even just targeting your opponent with it on turn 2 if they don't play anything can be fine. If you're planning on playing Bonecrusher on turn 3 anyway, you aren't giving anything up to get the damage right then. The combination of being a good threat and a good burn spell has led Bonecrusher to see a ton of play in almost every format. Red decks from Standard to Legacy have had success running the card. Despite all this power, there's just one adventure that's even more powerful and even more successful. And all the way at number 1, we have Brazen Borrower. This is a 3/1 fairy rogue with a mana cost of 1 and 2 blue. It has flash, meaning it can be cast anytime you would cast an instant, flying, and the ability where it can only block creatures with flying. It also has the adventure Petty Theft, an instant with the mana cost of 1 and 1 blue with the effect to bounce target non-land permanent and opponent controls. Brazen may seem like a bit of a bad creature, as a 3-power flyer with flying and a downside doesn't seem like the best rate. Flash does a ton to make this a lot better, as being able to keep your mana up for interactions on your opponent's turn and cast Borrower at the perfect time makes it far more versatile and ensures you can make the most use out of it. Even better, Borrower is itself a piece of interaction that you might want to be keeping up in the first place. Spells like Disperse are usually just okay, as 2 mana to bounce anything is a good tempo play, but the loss in card advantage means that they only see play in specific decks. Since Borrower doesn't ask you to lose any card advantage to play it, it's a far better spell than something like Disperse. Honestly, the rate is pretty on par with other bounce spells, with only a few bounce cards like Chain of Vapor really outpacing it. Being able to interrupt your opponent's plans for a simple 2 mana can really mess them up. If your opponent spends their entire turn casting a threat and you simply bounce it to their hand, you basically took their entire turn away. If you already have a threat of your own on the board, this creates a ton of pressure for your opponent. This is why the card sees play alongside cheap threats like Delver of Secrets and Dragon's Rage Channeler. 1 mana threats that can attack for 3 damage every turn. Not only that, but there are plenty of combo decks that either need permanents on the battlefield or result in slamming big threats on the field. Bouncing your opponent's Merit Lage after they went through their Dark Depths combo, or bouncing your opponent's creature they slipped their Colossus Hammer onto can put you in a much better position to win the game. The fact that Borrower is good in so many decks and so many formats has led to it seeing heavy play all the way back to Vintage. No other adventure has made itself an eternal staple the way Brazen Borrower has, so I think everyone probably expected to see the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave a comment down below.